Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. This is a horror movie review and I'll be having a look at the movie Shiver. So this is a 2012 serial killer horror movie. Now the story really focuses on two characters. The first played by Danielle Harris, and she plays a character called Wendy Alden, who's ultimately the protagonist of this movie. And she's just very average type of woman. She's got stuck in a sort of a job where she can't get a raise. She doesn't have a particularly good relationship with her mother, who's quite overbearing, and she's just in a very I believe quite a new relationship with a guy who seems a little bit awkward initially. And she's targeted by this serial killer who's been known as the Griffin, because he leaves this little statue of a griffin with all his victims. And his MO is to basically go after women. He beheads them, keeps the heads, and sexually abuses their body. And the killer's identity is known right from the get-go, so there's no real spoilers here. And he's just very when you look at him, he's just older gentleman, probably in his 50s or so, and very polite, outwardly, and mild-mannered. We get a couple of flashbacks with him showing maybe being bullied at some point. And he ultimately targets Wendy. Now, how he does it is explained later on in the film, but the police just think it's a random. He's selecting victims randomly, although there is a pattern, which is, you'll see halfway through this film. And he basically goes after Wendy, but she's actually uses her tenacity to get away from him. So he becomes a little bit obsessed with her, and after a variety of attempts, he finally is able to abduct her and plans to, because she's gives him some trouble almost. He feels like she's almost like a worthy adversary, to use his own words, and he thinks that they're destined to be together. But ultimately, this guy's obviously deranged, so stuff's going to go wrong. So the story really is about Wendy Alden. The character of Wendy Alden is using her wits and her presence of mind to try and get away from and ultimately defeat this guy. And it's one of the things I have to say of this movie's strengths is that its lead protagonist is a pretty decent change of pace that you may have seen in these horror films. I mean, she's not the typical screaming damsel in distress who always trips over and just completely loses her shit and can't think. She's actually, she is obviously scared and maybe a little bit too much sometimes. She's keeps her cool that little bit too much, but nevertheless, I quite like the change of pace, and she's able to use her wits and think her way out of situations and almost spar with him on a verbal basis to try and get the better of these situations. Now, she's not one of these badass women who's able to kick ass and take it down physically, because she's only a small woman. Nevertheless, she makes a formidable opponent, so I quite like that. It was very much against the type that you see in a lot of these slasher films, particularly the B-movie ones, because they tend to go for the stereotypes. So fairly good acting on her part, and I'd have to say the guy who plays a serial killer as well, I thought he did a pretty creepy job of almost outwardly being very polite and seemingly sociable, but obviously a very devious and dark-minded person, obviously, as you get to know him throughout the film. However, I have to say the rest of the cast were probably a little bit lackluster. The police in this movie seem to be pretty idiotic, to not to mince my words. The lead detective is played by Casper Van Dien, and he's okay, I guess, in the performance. You've got Ray Dawn Chong there as well as another detective, but they just seem to be so inadequate in able to deal with anything. There's a few instances where the Griffin basically comes face to face with the police, and ultimately just seems to so easily be able to get out of situations. It just seems they seem to just be so incompetent ultimately, the police. And there's a couple of instances where supporting characters as well are the acting's a little bit iffy, but particularly the police captain. It's a very small role, admittedly, but his acting was pretty poor. So all in all, it's a bit of a lackluster movie and pretty much middle of the road. However, one thing I would say maybe dips it a little bit below average for me was the climax of this movie. Now, it is almost a thriller, a psychological, very much like a typical serial killer movie, until the climax, which turns into an action film. And it reminds me of the Terminator. It just goes a little bit too far in downgrading this into what I would consider B-movie fodder. I won't go too much into the details, I don't want to spoil it for you. Nonetheless, I didn't really like the kind of the last sort of 10 minutes of this movie. I felt it felt very out of place and kind of almost detracted. Was probably, admittedly, probably an average movie, to be slightly below average. So I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 10. Not bad for kind of your B-movie serial killer, but it is a B-movie serial killer. So 4 out of 10 for me. What are your thoughts on it? Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.